Alright, are you ready to learn magic? I sure as heck hope so, because we're about to teach you with a cat. Of course, the best way to learn is to play. So let's jump into a game and we'll explain everything as we go. Hopefully, even if you already have some familiarity with magic, this video can fill you in on some of the details that are so key to making magic a truly compelling game. We're going to assume, though, that you know the basics. Magic is a card game, it's collectible like baseball cards, but way cooler than baseball cards because instead of dudes holding sticks, the cards are full of wizards, dragons, and the occasional spasm. Yep, you're right, and cats. Lots and lots of cats, actually. The game itself is basically a wizard duel, where, in no abstract terms, your goal is to reduce your opponent from 20 life to 0. Of course, there are a few other possible ways to win, like running your opponent out of cards. But for most of your magic existence, you'll primarily be punching each other in the face with creatures and spells until one of you falls over, figuratively. So let's get to it. James versus Zoe. Round 1. Fight. Alright, it's the first round, and Zoe draws 7 cards. Let's take a look at her hand. In Magic, there are 3 types of cards: instants, sorceries, and permanents. Instants are things you can play at any time. Sorceries are spells you can play only on your main phase, and permanents are literally everything else. Anything that sticks around, like creatures, artifact enchantments, lands, or other allied planeswalkers, are permanents. So, what's a main phase, I hear you asking? Well, I for one am very glad you are so eager to learn the technical side of the game. None of this slamming beasties into one another for you. You want to know about the phases and the rules. The meticulous stuff. And why wouldn't you? I mean, this is the internet after all, and it's just brimming with tons of patient people. We'll go over phases in a bit, once we've talked enough to make them interesting. But instead right now, let's just jump into Zoe's first main phase. This is where permanents can be played, so let's talk about them. Specifically though, let's first talk about one type of permanent, the single most common type of card you'll see in Magic: land. The idea in Magic is that mages draw their power from locations, and each location is tuned to a different elemental force. So mountains will provide your fuel for fire spells, and swamps will fuel things like death magic. This fuel is called mana, and you're going to use it to do everything in the game. Each of your turns, you can play a land. Then, you can tap your land, i.e. exhaust it for the turn. It's illustrated by turning the card sideways. And this provides you with mana to play your other cards. If you look here at the top right corner of any card, you'll find its mana cost. So for instance, our faithful Star-Crowned Stag here takes 1 white mana and 3 of any other color mana to cast. And what generates white mana? Plains. The symbol's nice and big on the card. Now if we look at Zoe's hand, there's nothing that costs just 1 white mana. So she'll end her turn and the play goes to James. James draws a card, drops a mountain on the table, and then taps it to cast a Goblin Motivator, because nothing motivates quite like goblins. But unfortunately, creatures get a little sick from being ripped from the ether and tossed into a strange battlefield in the middle of a wizard duel. We've all been there. So it can't tap or attack the turn they enter play. This is usually called summoning sickness. And since James has no more mana to use, and his Gobbo's still a little queasy, he passes the turn back to Zoe. Zoe starts her turn by drawing an Inspiring Commander, then puts down another land, and then taps both her mana to summon an Ajani's Pridemate. Which means it's time to talk about creatures. Here's the breakdown of a creature card. This is the creature's name. Yeah, I know, that's pretty self-explanatory. And this is the mana cost, which we've already covered. This right here is the creature type, which we don't really have to worry about right now. This symbol here tells you how rare the card is and what set it's from. Also not exactly relevant for this tutorial. But this text in the middle is called the rules text, and it tells you what special things the card does. And the italicized text right underneath it, that is called the flavor text, and it tells you about the world these cards exist in. Finally, there's these 2 numbers here. This one is the creature's power, and this one is its toughness. So how do power and toughness work? Power is how much damage a creature does, and toughness is how much damage it can take in a turn before it dies. How would it take damage, you ask? Oh, we'll be getting to that in a moment. But first, it's time to enumerate phases! Told you we'd get to it. A Magic turn consists of 7 phases. 1. Untap. 2. Upkeep. 3. Draw. 4. Main phase. 5. Attack phase. 6. Second main phase. And 7. End step. And while we were blaring those air horns, James put down another mountain and passed. So since it's Zoe's turn again, let's walk through all those phases. First, she begins with the untap step. This is when the things you used in the previous turn become usable again. So Zoe untaps the 2 land that she used the last turn to cast Ajani's Pridemate. Remember that land once tapped can't be tapped again until your following turn. And this is important because a big part of the strategy of Magic is thinking about what resources you want to leave available to you on your opponent's turn. So, let's move on to upkeep. Your upkeep phase is a time when you pay ongoing costs, but it'll be a long ways into your time with Magic before you have to deal with this. Not to mention, Zoe here's in the same boat and has nothing to do, so she moves on to the next phase. The draw phase, where you, draw a card. And now we're back to Zoe's main phase. This is where you can play basically anything, if you've got the mana. Main phases are the only time you can play permanents or sorceries, but you can also play instants during them too. So Zoe lays down her 3rd land. Now, you can see that she could play the Pegasus Courser, but she's not going to yet. Why? Well, remember how we said there's a second main phase that comes right after combat? Well, she's gonna play it there, because if she played it now, her opponent would know she's out of mana when she attacks. But with 3 mana still open, she could have any number of tricks up her sleeve, if she wore sleeves, that she could play during combat. So she declares attackers by tapping the creatures she wants to attack with. In this case, the Ajani's Pridemate. Now James must declare his blockers. He could block with the Goblin Motivator, but he doesn't want to do that, because it only has 1 power and only 1 toughness. In this case, he'd rather let the Pridemate through and take the damage himself, so he can use the Motivator later. But, for the sake of argument, let's say he did block. What would happen? Well then, we'd move to the damage-dealing part of combat, where each creature would assign its damage. Attackers to the creatures they were blocked by, and blockers to the creatures they blocked. So in this case, the Goblin Motivator would deal 1 point of damage to the Pridemate, not enough to kill it. But the Pridemate would assign 2 to the Motivator, sending it straight to the graveyard. That's the place where things go after they've been used up, essentially. If James had 2 Motivators, he could block with both of them and kill the Pridemate. But the Pridemate would still kill both of the Motivators, since Zoe can assign damage to the blockers any way she chooses. But enough hypotheticals. Let's get back to our real game's timeline. James decides to let the Ajani Pridemate punch him in his wizard face, doing 2 damage directly to him, and reducing him to 18 life. The key thing about damage, though, is to remember that damage on creatures only lasts until the end of the turn. So if James did block with his Goblin, the Pridemate would be back to having 2 health as soon as Zoe ended her turn. But Zoe's not ready to end her turn yet. Now that combat's done, she's on to her 2nd main phase, and it's here that she plays her Pegasus Courser. Then having no more mana left, she ends her turn and moves to her end step, where if she had more than 7 cards in her hand, she would have to discard back down to 7. It's back to James's turn, who untaps, draws a card, and then enters his main phase. His Goblin Motivator's a little stuck. It'll just die if it attacks due to Zoe's Pegasus. But luckily for him, he's got the sorcery card Ragefire, which he plays. It does 3 damage to the Pegasus, which only has a 3 toughness, so now it's the Pegasus's turn for a trip to Zoe's graveyard. And because the Pridemate is tapped due to attacking last turn, it can't block. Which means now, James is free to swing in for that sweet point of damage with his Motivator. One thing to note here, though, is that if Ragefire had been an instant card, James could have cast it during Zoe's last turn. But because it's a sorcery, he had to wait until his main phase. Now at this point, I'm sure you're seeing there's a ton of cool tricky things you can do with instants in order to mess with your opponent's plans. But that's going to be its whole own episode. In the meantime, James ends his turn, passes to Zoe, and she draws up Oh my gosh. It's the all-powerful James You Have an Extra Credits episode due in an hour card, setting his health and time instantly to 0 and exiling him to his computer with a nice cup of tea. Well, I guess they're gonna have to pick this up another time. Another time like next week, when we talk about cool stuff like figuring out what type of elemental mage you are, or in less internet personality quiz terms, what color deck you might want to play. Spoiler alert! I'm a red-black Samantha.
What do you think, pal? Oh, are they good? Are these that good? Should I use... Which one? Yes. We're gonna play an island.